Hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. If you can't hear me, then just say in the chat. But yeah, thank you so much for coming to what should be an excellent event. Before we get started, I just wanted to quickly kind of introduce some of the groups co-sponsoring this talk. People who've kind of worked really hard to make this happen. So firstly, there's a radical guide, which is just that. It's a guide that offers historical and current locations, people, and places of interest that highlight the wonderful world of resistance, resistance in the spirit of creating a better world for all that is not rooted in capitalism, competition, and hierarchy, and the radical spirit. Also, the Anthropology and Social Change Department at the California Institute of Integral Studies is an institute that teaches activist research, an integral relationship that transforms both the researcher and the community into active participants in producing knowledge and in transforming themselves. And they are co-publishers with PM Press of the book that James Kelman has produced with Noam Chomsky, Between Thought and Expression Lies a Lifetime. And PM is an independent radical publisher of books and media. Is an independent radical publisher of books and media to arm dreamers to demand the impossible. And of course, lastly, there's Working Class History, which is a project that aims to popularize history of struggle from below through our podcast, which is available via pretty much any and all podcast apps. And you can also find us on most social media platforms for kind of on this day content. And we're also starting to branch out into videos on YouTube and TikTok. So I'm sure that you all know very well who our guests are today, but basically the conventions of the forum state that I should give them an introduction. So James Kelman is a Scottish novelist, a short story writer, a playwright, and essayist whose many literary awards include the Booker Prize and the James Tate Black Prize. He's been called the greatest British novelist of our time, and his new novel, God's Teeth and Other Phenomena, is forthcoming from PM Press in 2022. Noam Chomsky is a laureate professor at the University of Arizona and professor emeritus in the MIT Department of Linguistics and Philosophy. His work is widely credited with having revolutionized the field of modern linguistics. And not content with that, Chomsky is also one of the foremost critics of US foreign policy. He's published numerous groundbreaking books, articles, and essays on global politics, history, and linguistics. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to send my best wishes to Noam, as it's his birthday tomorrow. So I'm sure everyone in the chat, if you want to say happy birthday to Noam Chomsky, do feel free. So I realise we're running late, so I'll keep it brief on my end, because I think we want to get into speaking to our guests. But so for today's event, Jim is going to be giving us a reading from the book, and this is going to be followed by a discussion between James and Noam. And finally, there's going to be a Q&A at the end, and you can submit your questions via the chat on your respective social media platforms. But as questions are going to be pulled at a specific time during the broadcast, do please hold your questions till the Q&A itself. Though obviously, do feel free to leave comments and reactions at any time during the broadcast. Yeah, I think that's it for me. I think apart from just saying, I'm really pleased and really excited to be here at this event. So yeah, without further ado, Jim, would you like to start us off with your reading?
This was an introduction that I gave back in 1990 at the self-determination event, where Noam Chomsky was giving the keynote address. So this was the introduction that I gave. Noam Chomsky is not only a major Western philosopher, he's a major thinker of the left. In one way or another, he spent most of his life in the struggle against oppression and against greed. There are at least three things I see to put him out on a limb. One, in philosophical terms, he believes there are certain kinds of knowledge available to folk right at birth, before they've had any experience gained from living in the actual world. This seems the most comprehensive way of explaining how it is we're able to know and understand things in the way that we do. Two, as a committed thinker of the left, he insists on discussing politics at almost every opportunity, not only in conversation but on the page. He is as likely to publish an article in the secretive and murderous affairs of state as he is to publish an essay in philosophy or aspects of transformational grammar. The third reason Noam can be considered subversive has to do with the dissemination of knowledge. The tremendous range of work he does in spreading information, just getting things known to the public at large. It's central to his thesis that everybody can know. There is no body of theory or significant body of relevant information beyond the comprehension of the layperson that makes policy immune from criticism. Unless we're mentally ill or in some other way more disadvantaged, all of us have the analytic skills and intelligence to attempt an understanding of the world. The skills demanded of an elderly person playing several hands of bingo. The skills demanded of a single parent to get to the supermarket and do a weekly shopping on a limited budget for a large family of young kids. All of these skills are there to be developed and applied to any subject whatsoever, including subjects like a country's foreign policy, or the correlation between cuts in welfare and infant mortality, between cuts in welfare and suicide, cuts in welfare and drug abuse, alcohol abuse, prostitution, madness. No one should have any illusions about how political this can be, just spreading information. It's probably the basic premise in most countries of the world that everybody cannot know. Once you finish school, college, or university, you're encouraged to stop learning, to stop finding things out. You're trained to leave intellectual matters to the experts. Even existence itself, you're trained to leave the living of your life to those who specialize in such concepts. The folk who are paid by the state. They won't live your life for you, but they'll determine how it should be lived. They'll let you know what's possible and what isn't possible. Similar to the situation of being a child in society, it's appropriate here. Parent is expert. But so too is the situation of a group or class or an entire race of people under domination or colonization, external or internal. Folk who cannot determine their own existence. They're in thrall. The right to self-determination has been taken from them, and it's kept from them, often by force, by the calculated violence of those in power. We should remember that at that self-determination event 30 years ago, there were people whose commitment to social change has meant they've been imprisoned and they've had to face various degrees of harassment and personal danger, even just to get to the actual event. There were people with us who were unable to raise their family within the traditions and customs of their own culture. There were people here on that first morning who cannot even live in their own country. Professor Chomsky is wary of links being made between his work on the philosophies of mind and language and his work in politics, and he gives good grounds for that. As he said in a recent interview, obviously one cannot infer anything about politics from what you know about universal grammar or controversy. But at the same time, there is something implicit in the very fact of our existence as human beings, and that is freedom and a right to self-determination, the right to not be tortured, the right to not be raped, the right to not be violated, the right to not be colonized in any way whatsoever. And from my own reading of Noam's work, that is his position. And either we do battle on that principle of freedom or we don't. That'll do for the opening. So I could just say that part of why I began the big long essay in the first place was because I tried to bridge that gap from what Noam had said. I tried to indicate in ways that there could be an inference in terms of a political influence from the idea, going back to that common sense tradition of philosophy, where you might say the core belief derived from that idea that of the inviolability of all human beings and the uniqueness. Because of that, the basic premise, as it is to some extent, not that I would say every extent, is empathy and solidarity. That's what I see as being an inference from various technical points. So I'll say that to kick off.
Yeah, I mean, and I suppose this kind of relates to sort of one of the things that I found in reading this this book is that there's a sort of like a multidisciplinarity or a kind of I think what you call it like a generalist approach to education, to knowledge, and that really kind of comes through, that there's a kind of, you're working simultaneously with like philosophy, politics, and then even kind of branching out to the mathematics and science, and then art, literature, and I think there's you kind of make those links between Chomsky's various kind of branches of work, and it seems to me that it's important for you to weave these various threads together, and it's more than just kind of like a general kind of interest. It seems that there's like an ethical, political concern there. And I was wondering, maybe could you talk about kind of why you kind of feel it's important to pull those various kind of trends, various kind of also various threads together like that?
You want me to come in? Should I come in there?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, one of the things about it is simply it's these aspects of Noam's work, or your work, Noam, the sense that everyone has the capacity to know, to learn, and to be critical of policy and so on. There are these essential elements to what it is to be a human being, and part of what was going on that I had been aware of is that the spread of education in this way can coincide with movements against the existing order. This was a case in maybe 18th century or early 19th century in my own country, where there was things happening at that time, where the development of education that way coincided with people attempting to change or to determine their own existence. Meant eventually that we're having to take on the state in some way or another. So I tried to kind of link in, or try to show how these things may go together. That was part of the original, I suppose, motivation I had in starting work on Noam's work and trying to draw into the common sense tradition in philosophy as it applied in Scotland. I mean, that's a bit of a ramble, but it's the best I can do just now. Noam, is there anything that that you can come back on there or want to say from there?
What I should? Well, I'm listening with great interest to the dialogue. I'd like to thank a lot of the people in the chat for their greetings. Of the various things you discussed, let's start with why ideas matter. That's like asking, why do human beings matter? If we go back to the earliest records that we have, classical Greece, 2,500 years ago, the priestess at the Delphic oracle issued a kind of a declaration. Whether this is myth or not, we don't know, but take it to be real. The injunction was, know thyself. I think that's what links everything together and also answers why ideas matter. So when we ask, this aphorism, know thyself, was intended individually, you should understand yourself in Socratic terms. An examined life, an unexamined life is not worth living. So it's an individual injunction. But it makes a lot more sense to interpret it collectively. The reason is that humans are remarkable for two reasons. One is humans are very much alike. There's very little biological diversity among humans. Biologists tell us that if you find a small troop of monkeys somewhere, they will probably have more genetic diversity among them than the entire human race. We're a species that emerged very suddenly, very recently, a couple 100,000 years ago, blink of an eye in evolutionary time. And to know ourselves is to find out what is special about human beings, all of us. If we look closely, one of the things is having ideas. Like, I have some delightful creatures waiting calmly under my desk for when I'll be done with all this nonsense, so I can, don't want to use the words, but can extricate them to the outdoors. But they have some things in their mind which we might call ideas, maybe a dozen of them. Humans are different. We have an infinite number of them. A lot of them we find it hard even to access. It takes special talent, special work, and much of our life is devoted to trying to access these ideas in our mind and to use them. And that makes, and this is done through language. In fact, if we ask what are the distinctive features of human beings, the two that we find are language and thought. And if we look closely, we see that they're basically identical. Actually, this was recognized at about the same time as the Delphic oracle in the early days of the rich Indian tradition India and South Asia, Indian tradition. We have a record of it, a rich record of philosophy, science, thought. And 2,500 years ago, some of the founders of this tradition simply identified thought and language. Thought is the means of, language is the means of forming, constructing thought. Thought is what is generated by language. And these are basically the core of our nature, distinguish us radically from any other organism. There's nothing, when you look at more carefully at the nature of these systems, there aren't even any analogs in other organisms. So something strange and amazing happened about 200,000 years ago. These capacities haven't changed since. We have strong evidence for that. Humans began separating from one another about 150,000 years ago. We have genomic evidence to show that, at least that far, which is not long after Homo sapiens emerged, and there's been no change since. They all have the language faculty, same one, same faculty of thinking. You can pick up an infant in Papua New Guinea and an uncontacted tribe which hasn't had contact with other humans for 40,000 years. Bring it up in Glasgow, it'll be like a normal kid from Glasgow can go on to the university and become a quantum physicist. And conversely, the rich, complex skills and abilities that you find in pre-technological societies are things that I couldn't manage. I've seen them, I couldn't possibly do them, but if I'd grown up there, it would be as natural to me as talking about these topics. So humans seem to be basically identical, and they have these astonishing capacities. I should say that throughout intellectual history, there has been continual amazement expressed at these capacities, and rightly. So we go to the origins of the scientific revolution in the West and Europe, 17th century. Galileo and his associates were completely reconstructing scientific inquiry in a new manner, scientific revolution. And language didn't escape their attention. Galileo's contemporaries were amazed and awed at what they regarded correctly as a remarkable fact that with a couple of dozen symbols, we can construct infinitely many thoughts. And even beyond that, we can find ways to convey to others the innermost workings of our mind, even though they have no access to our mind. For this reason, Galileo regarded the alphabet as the most spectacular invention in human history, because it was able to implement these astonishing capacities. Well, that's humans. And if we look, we're turning to links. If we look more closely, we find several distinct facets of these human capacities. We can illustrate them by a day which is seared in my personal memory, a remarkable day in human history, August 6th, 1945, which revealed to us that one aspect of human intelligence had risen to the level where it had found means to destroy everything. Hadn't quite reached that point yet, but it was clear that what was opened up on that day would lead soon to that point. In fact, it did a few years later with thermonuclear weapons. So that's one aspect of human capacity. Another aspect is our moral capacity. Do we have the moral capacity to control the demons that our intellectual capacity has created? The verdict on that is not very encouraging. If you look through the record of 75 years of development of the capacity for total destruction, it's a miracle that we've survived. Actual miracle. There's been case after case when total disaster came very close and was averted almost by miracles. In fact, we're approaching one right now with the growing serious threats of needless confrontation, likely terminal war in several parts of the globe, off the coast of China, in Eastern Europe, Ukraine. All of these problems we know how to solve, but our moral capacities don't allow us to overcome what some of our creative capacities have constructed. Wasn't known in 1945. Well, it wasn't known then. It is known now that at that point, the human species was entering into a new epoch. In fact, geologists now call it a new epoch in the history of life, of the history of the world, of the universe, the anthropocene.
I'm just wondering, I was just wondering if I could come in for a minute there. Could I come in for a minute here? Is it possible to come in for a minute here? No?
Yeah, I think you can go for it, Jim. Yeah.
It's only, I just wanted to raise a couple of things from what you were saying, Noam. If you can hear me there, okay. I wanted to come in and say a couple of things in terms of what you were saying. One, just to do with language, not language acquisition, but how we know. And one of the features to draw attention to is that Matt, the guy who's chairing, had referred to the different areas of knowledge and the different subjects that are referred to within the book. And I wanted to refer to that, and also refer to the other thing in terms of how we know that it takes two people to know things. It takes two in order to have a dialogue and a discussion for us to understand things. So language in that sense, taking what you say about language, but two people are necessary in order for the language to exist. We're not talking to ourselves. We're talking to one another, and how we make sense of the world and understand. We need people. We need people to be able to do these things. If we talk about, I personally am always wary about arguments to do with the end of the world or the end of mankind, because people are being killed every day of the week, and they're being oppressed every day of the week. And in a sense, the issue that we can also get to from your analysis, that is like, how do we struggle against these things that are happening right now? How do we take on these things? How do we take on the state right now? How do we form bonds of solidarity with other struggles? You know what I mean? To take benefit from how other people are acting in ways to try. I mean, I take what you say about what can happen to end the world. At the same time, as we know, there are people throughout the world who are fighting back right now as we talk. There are areas of resistance going on everywhere. The reason that things are being stopped is because of the state maybe actually taking pains to do something about it. So that's one of it's just to raise that side of it, not in which I find it's just such a crucial thing that people are aware of that sense of solidarity. Where does it come from? Why is empathy such a danger to the state? If we go back, Noam, you'll remember in the book itself, speaking about, I refer to Socrates and Xenophon, and that idea of the kind of learning that Xenophon had. It's that idea that distinguished an Athenian from a Spartan was how the Spartans For the Spartan, like armies everywhere, it was the chain of command that mattered. Only the chain of command. The first thing that happens within any army is to destroy empathy. You must have no feeling for your fellow human being. You must only listen to your superior and do as you're told. There is no room for a discretionary measure. All of these things that are part of empathy, are part of solidarity, are the things that the state try and get rid of. And these are things I feel that people can actually attempt to take that and get that from your work and others that concentrates on these factors, the kind of thing that 17th century thinkers they were trying to deal with these things in face of maybe at the beginning of English and British Empire, that expansionism. These things they had a very real effect and have a very real effect in how people try and take on the state. So I feel that it's a really kind of important aspect of it.
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry, no. Did you wanted to respond to that?
Yeah. Well, let me start with one of the comments in reaction to what you just said, which I was thinking about too. It's from Alicia, who says, to have empathy is to recognize your neighbor as your family, your equal. That's why it's so threatening to the state.
Yeah.
That's actually a virtual definition of which we've been living through for the last 50 years. It's called technically neoliberalism. It starts with Reagan and Thatcher. Thatcher saying, denying this. She says, there is no society. There is just you and your self-interest. Okay? So forget everything else. You alone will survive somehow in the ravages of the market, and there's no solidarity. And she made that very explicit, not just your neighbor metaphorically. Recall that her first act back 40 years ago was to move to destroy labor unions. That means to destroy solidarity, to destroy the opportunity for people to get together, to work together, to get ideas together, to understand the world together, and to act with solidarity to achieve the common good. That's the essence of unions, internationally, incidentally. So the first thing to do was destroy that, throw people out as atomized individuals with no society. Actually, Thatcher probably didn't know it, but she was paraphrasing Marx, who was in the 19th century, mid-19th century, condemned the autocrats of Europe for trying to turn the population into what he called a sack of potatoes. People who are isolated, atomized, don't know their neighbors, don't talk to their neighbors, but somehow are alone facing concentrated power. That was the ideal. That was what so-called neoliberalism has worked towards. It was mirrored in the United States with different words, but the same ideology and the same consequences. Ronald Reagan's inaugural address, 1981, the central line repeated ever since is government is the problem, not the solution. What does that mean? Government is the one general institution which is somewhat responsive to the population, not very much because it's under too much external control from concentrated power, but at least has some degree of accountability. Well, if you take decisions away from government, they don't disappear. They move somewhere else, to the centers of unaccountable private power. That's where decisions rest. So that's the ideal. What the real definition of neoliberalism is: brutal, ruthless class war. Place power in the centers of unaccountable institutions, and we know how they operate, how they're supposed to operate. It was told right at the same time by Milton Friedman, the economic guru of neoliberalism, that corporations, that's concentrated economic power, have one responsibility: to enrich themselves and nothing else. To become a corporation, become incorporated is a gift from the public. You're given all kind of advantages, but no responsibility comes with that. Just enrich yourself and your management. Now, there's an addendum to Thatcher's prescription, no society, which she certainly knew. For the rich and powerful, there's plenty of society. There's a very rich and complex society that works for them. One, in fact, is the government. When Reagan said government is the problem, he or whoever wrote his speeches for him knew very well that that was nonsense. What they meant is, we want a rich, powerful, interventionist government which will work in our interest, not in the interests of the general public, not for the common good. So for us, there's rich society, the government, chambers of commerce, trade associations, think tanks, all sorts of rich, complex societies that assist us in carrying out the class war. And you, the victims, the population, you're a sack of potatoes. You don't have any society. You don't have unions. You don't talk to each other. You're just thrown out on the market somehow to survive. If we want to know what's happening, we can go back to Edinburgh and Glasgow in the mid-18th century. One of my kind of fantasies is to be a space traveler and go back to what I can imagine to be my favorite place, a coffee house in Edinburgh, where I could intrude and listen in on a conversation between Adam Smith and David Hume, both of whom believed that sympathy with others is the core of our nature. Actually, in one of his two uses of the word invisible hand, only two relevant ones in his writings, Adam Smith argued that if all the wealth of the societies, wealth meant land in those days, so if one rich landowner appropriated all the land for himself, it really wouldn't matter that much, because the society would be egalitarian, because his sympathy with others would lead him to distribute it in an egalitarian manner, because sympathy with others is so fundamental to our nature. Well, he also understood some other things. In another part of that conversation I'd like to have heard, he wrote in 1776 that the masters of mankind, his words, who were at his day the merchants and manufacturers of England, are the principal architects of government policy. They control the government, and they make sure that their own interests are peculiarly attended to, no matter how grievous the fate of others under their attack. That's Thatcher, Reagan, neoliberalism.
I wonder whether I could make a point there in terms of that part of what you're saying. When you refer to Thatcher, 10 years before, Margaret Thatcher made the statement around about 1979 when she came into power. 10 years before that, in 1969, at the end, when Kenya got its independence during the end of the colonial period in Africa, the actual army who were there imposing colonial rule in Kenya were basically kind of disbanded and went elsewhere. They spoke at that time they came to the States and spoke to people there. At that point in 1969, Edward Heath, who was regarded as a kind of liberal kind of conservative MP rather than a right winger, he actually asked, how is it that we can kill people? How can we kill people? The aim is to kill members of our own society. That was the same point when people who had come from the former colonial part of Africa became in command of the British troops in Northern Ireland. The face of policing altered structurally in the UK at that period. Within the space of about 6 months, they walked in and they murdered ordinary civilians in part of Belfast called Ballymurphy. 6 months later, they shot dead people in Derry, known as Bloody Sunday. Something like 5 or 6 years later, by this time, the guys in charge, they actually moved back to the mainland and took control before Margaret Thatcher came to power. At this point, people knew the government was basically the managers for the state. Basically the military were changing how the police and the army would operate. They already had murder squads. Formed. They went in and it's far more ruthless. The UK situation, in a sense, is far more ruthless and far more dangerous than that Thatcher era. Things had changed before that period. They really had altered before then.
I just want to.
We can see that throughout the 70s and going into the way that the police were used in battles against the black population. It was really shocking, these things that happened. 1979, the police walked in and they murdered Blair Peach at a big anti-racist demonstration in Southall, Middlesex. There were more than 2,000 police occupied that town only 2 weeks before Thatcher came to power. So it's really maybe a different can of worms. It's not something to be raising here, perhaps, But anyway.
I think it's a really interesting point. I think what you brought up, Jim, about the army kind of having to drill out empathy in its soldiers, and I think this idea that kind of neoliberalism stamps out these kind of solidaristic and kind of communal feeling within kind of populations, and I think that's right. I think if you think about society as a whole, kind of it sort of encourages things like competition and really kind of encourages sort of individuals to not just not know their neighbors, but even to be in competition, to be at each other's throats. But yet at the same time, empathy still endures, solidarity still endures, communal kind of feeling and organizing still endures. And I think that's something, I think that gets raised in the book somewhat, that, there is this kind of will to freedom. And I think that's been kind of sort of discussed by philosophers, throughout history. And I wonder maybe if either of you guys would like to kind of speak on that kind of how you see that will to freedom, either kind of being theorized down the years and also maybe how it plays out.
Humans are complicated creatures. We have empathy, sympathy, violence, hatred, savagery. It's all part of humans. Which ones come to the fore depends on many different situations, different circumstances. Often we see them at the same time, like this minute. One of the plague what's in the forefront of the minds of many people, rightly, is the pandemic. Notice the different reactions. You go to poor neighborhoods, miserable neighborhoods, like the favelas in Brazil, poor, miserable neighborhoods. You can think of many others. There are astonishing cases of empathy, sympathy, and solidarity. People living in utterly miserable conditions who nevertheless they don't even have running water, have organized themselves to give help to others, while the state, of course, does nothing. That's one aspect. We see it all over the world. Plenty of examples. If an elderly man is stuck in his home, people bring him food. People organize soup kitchens on their own, out of their own initiative. That's one aspect of human nature. Then we go to the stately halls and see what's happening. We see that the rich and powerful are monopolizing vaccines for themselves, refusing to break the neoliberal, highly radical anti-market neoliberal principles that provide extreme monopoly pricing rights to major corporations. So they don't, so for example, Moderna, which now has a couple of new multi-billionaires, had nothing a couple of years ago, thanks to government funding, now refuses to allow its processes of manufacture of the Moderna vaccine to countries like South Africa, which has a pharmaceutical industry, to give them the process. They could be producing the vaccines, which would have very likely prevented the Omicron mutation, which is now spreading over the world. So we have the rich and the powerful sitting in their luxurious suites who are saying, sorry, we have to protect the rights of corporations and keep for monopoly pricing. They've got money coming out of their ears, and keep the vaccines for ourselves. And knowing, incidentally, in the intellectual corner of their minds, that it's suicidal, because they're creating, not only killing innumerable number of people, but also creating the basis for mutations, which will come back to them. You got that on one side. You have acts of sympathy and solidarity on the other. These are various components of human nature. Actually, you saw them on the streets of Glasgow about a week ago, when there were two major events going on called COP26. One was inside the halls where the suits and jackets and ties were talking to each other and trying to figure out ways not to do anything to solve the major crisis in human history, though they know how to do it. And their major decision was to meet next year and maybe say something while the world burns. That was one event. There was another event in the streets where tens of thousands of people, mostly young people, were demonstrating, calling on the wealthy and powerful to do what they know how to do to overcome the crisis and open the way to a better world. Well, that's two aspects of human nature revealed in two different kinds of institutions. One the powerful concentrations of capital and power, state and private, on the one hand, with their fingers around our throats, strangling us, the other in the streets saying we want to survive. Well, that's human nature, is all of those things. Human institutions vary. Which one of these forces will prevail will determine whether there's anything to talk about in the future.
You know, Noam, if I can come in there, there's just a slant in what you're saying. I want to introduce here. When you mentioned Marx earlier, and of course Karl Marx being very influenced by people like Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson, and was very aware of that train in the Scottish philosophical tradition. But one of the things that came out of it, you could say, is Marxist humanism, and it's Marxist humanism that gets missed so often, and his absolute sensitivity to alienation, and the idea that human beings are divorced from their own humanity. Now, part of that kind of filtered, unfortunately, through the ordinary labour, traditional labour and socialist movement. And I see this as connected to what you're arguing here. The most crucial thing for any trade unionist should always be issues around health and safety. Health and safety has been the most crucial issue, and the other one, which is reducing the hours of employment and labour, so that people have the chance of becoming full human beings. They know that they will not have to work in an asbestos factory, for example. They know they will not have to work as they are in parts of not too far from you are in Texas, where people are having to contend with extraordinary industrial disease and waste right on their doorstep. These issues have been around for like 120, 150 years. And the traditional labour movement has done nothing to support it. They have constantly walked away from these issues. So I don't see this as a kind of contemporary issue. To me, it's to do with it's to do with the mainstream traditional or establishment left. It's to do without having a proper critique of the state, without having a proper critique of government. I mean, people in the traditional left wing in the United Kingdom, they have to go into the Whitehall Parliament and say, "God save the Queen," otherwise they'll be thrown out the damn place. I mean, that's how absurd it is. But these are the people that are controlling. So in a sense, that I don't even see any need to talk about right-wing people in that sense, because the control has been unfortunately kept by people. I wouldn't even call them liberal. They're traditional mainstream left-wing people. They walk away from the argument anyway. Just introducing that point. Apologies for the emotion.
No, I mean, I think it's a really great point, Jim. Also, because I think now, because we've gone so far down the kind of the neoliberal route, we've almost sort of forgotten a lot of the struggles that were had, between workers and social democracy, and what was sort of considered to be, the workers and the trade unions kind of now, having a seat at the bargaining table, either with employers through kind of, forced collective bargaining by the state, or, directly, with the state itself. I wonder, do you see, do you see that there any sort of, attention that exists within sort of present movements, with a kind of an inability to see beyond kind of social democracy as a possibility, because I feel like now when we think about politics, everything seems to have kind of gotten limited at maybe at the most kind of a left Labourism or something like that.
Well, but Noam referred to the big conference that took place in Glasgow. I've forgotten the name of the damn thing. But, and there were thousands of young people, mainly young people and people on the traditional left, and not only the traditional, people on the radical left who were demonstrating about that. This reminds me of the conference 30 years ago. At the same time that was happening in Glasgow, they were closing down libraries. Why was the traditional left, why were they not demonstrating and outside the libraries that they're all being closed down in Glasgow in order to pay for that damn conference? And that's the kind of thing that the blinkers are on, that traditional kind of approach to, that's the kind of thing that makes me angry, and it makes me really emotional. Young people will be battered by the police for nothing. And the people that should be standing for them, like the Labour Party and those, and the Communist Party, any party that is content to go, for example, with the Labour Party, demands my contempt, and they will get it for these reasons.
There's unions, and then there's the Labour Party. Not the same thing.
Yeah.
At that meeting in Glasgow that you referred to, I presume you recall that it was a great conference of people, mostly unemployed workers, writers, all sorts of people gathering. Fantastic gathering. At the time, I had an invitation from a foundation in Scotland, Edinburgh, to give a talk. I think it was called the Scottish National Foundation or some name like that, which was Labour supported. They demanded that I withdraw from our event conference because they wouldn't let me have a platform if I was going to be associated with this riffraff. I think that was the Labour Party. So of course I told them to get lost, but that's the Labour Party. On the other hand, there are the working people, which is most of the population, who, when they join together, have accomplished a great deal. Take social democracy. Go back to the 1930s, my childhood. It was a horrible, dangerous, desperate situation. The depression was much deeper than anything that's happening now. My family were immigrants, unemployed, working class. There was a sense of hopefulness and even of optimism about what would be great. Why? Because they were in the labor movement. My aunts, who were unemployed seamstresses, were in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which was, first of all, along with much of the rest of the labor movement, reviving from a bitter attack under Woodrow Wilson, which had almost destroyed it in the 1930s, began to revive, began to take militant actions. It was much more than, and they made a huge difference. They got to the point of, with CIO organizing, of moving on to sit-down strikes. That's very serious. That's one step before telling the bosses, we don't need you. We can run this place much better than you can by ourselves. At that point, the business world withdrew its bitter opposition to all New Deal measures. The Supreme Court stopped killing every measure that was proposed. And they recognized we better take notice, we better do something before they take the next step. And you get a kind of accommodation. And the United States introduced a form of social democracy. As soon as they had a chance, the business world started attacking it. The neoliberal assault, the recent version, but it achieved a lot. And it was duplicated in England and continental Europe in the post-war period. It was a kind of a radical democratic sentiment that emerged globally from the Second World War and the Depression. But those were major achievements. The labor movement, take my ants again, weren't just let's get a job, let's get a decent wage. It was also cultural activities, educational activities, science, philosophy. These were people, many of whom had barely gone to school, who were discussing the latest concert of the Budapest String Quartet, or the Shakespeare play in Central Park, or different varieties of psychoanalysis. They were involved in high culture with no formal education, very much like the conference we went to. People with little formal education, but discussing the same kind of topics you discuss in a seminar at elite universities. It's not, this is available to everyone. Well, that was the labor movement, not the Labor Party, the labor movement. And that can be reconstituted. And you can see how threatening it is. Jeremy Corbyn was making moves to develop a Labor Party which would actually be participatory. It would reflect the interests of the participants, and it would work for the interests of working people and the general population. And you go back to 2017 and look at the results then, and they show that there was enormous popular support from them. That aroused real fear in the British establishment. Across the board, huge campaign to nip this in the bud before it takes off. I don't have to go through it. Went all through the media, including the liberal media, the Parliamentary Labour Party, all kind of invented charges and campaigns. We have to destroy this before it takes off. We don't want a popular movement of working people, poor people, which will take over themselves and work for the common good. That's the greatest danger. They have to be left as a sack of potatoes. We saw that very dramatically in England, and we're seeing it now in the United States as well. It's a constant battle, constant class war by the rich and powerful, by those who Adam Smith called the masters of man.
In Scotland, they would have seen it differently. You know, it would have been here what happened with Jeremy Corbyn was predictable. It was inevitable. There is nothing within the Labour Party history that would have allowed that to happen. It wasn't possible. It was just kind of foolish. I mean, it's not been possible in the Labour Party for since about 1922, when the radical Clydeside MPs took over. Nothing like that has ever been possible. It was put in place at that time. Both the Communist Party, you could actually say that the Communist Party and the Tory Party destroyed it. There was nothing there. It was gone. It was gone from the Comintern period with Lenin. It was gone from the period when the Labour Party had already given up. They had basically kicking out the ILP. Every time the Labour Party get a left-wing movement, they destroy it. That's what the history of the Labour Party is. It's nothing. So anyway.
I wonder, Jim. I mean, because for me, I think probably I share the same kind of skepticism of the Labour Party that you've got, and I wonder if maybe because the way that I sort of feel about the Labour left as being maybe the only faction in party politics, because the Labour left sort of see themselves as a kind of as representing the working class, whereas every other sort of faction in the Labour Party, in the Tory Party, everywhere,
But they
they
don't
see themselves.
No,
But in terms of
you can't confuse England with Scotland, Wales, and Ireland.
I mean, I personally don't think
the Labour Party has no presence in the Scottish government worth talking about. There's no point in talking about it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
no,
just not a point in talking about it.
Because I think what you were saying about the problems with the Labour Party going way back, even to like Ramsay MacDonald and all of that kind of stuff.
No, he was a
I think that's right.
guy,
Yeah, but like,
let's talk about a better form of left wing that existed in the UK at that time, before the 1920 conference in Moscow. There was a very strong anti-parliamentarian left wing. People like Willie Gallagher. When John Maclean was in prison, there was Arthur McManus, who was the first secretary of the CP. The guy was eventually, he was one of the ones who was named in the Zinoviev letter and was eventually shot dead in the Kremlin. I mean, there was a very strong left-wing movement at that time. The Labour Party that was strong in the UK at that time was ILP, Independent Labour Party. And at that time, there was even a strong anti-sectarianism, at least in Scotland there was. You would have had anti-parliamentarians standing the same platform as people in the format before the CP was formed, the old British Socialist Party. You'd have had them with the SLP, which was James Connolly's party. You'd have had a very strong kind of what could you say, left wing that included various denominations. It's a bit similar to what Noam was saying about the different kind of people who were at the conference in 1990. People had come from all over. People had come from came from Leningrad. Noam may remember, and some people who were here, that Victor Krivulin was here. A really an extraordinary Russian poet, member of the left. He was here. John LaRose was here from the Black Parents movement down south that had led so many anti-racist struggles in the UK. Now, Roxy Harris, Gus John was here, who interviewed you, you'll remember Gus. Eugene MacDonald was the foremost left-wing QC in the UK. They were all in government at that time. For the one that Noam's talking about. Hamish Henderson was here, Angus McNichol, Tom Leonard, Alistair Gray. It was so exciting in all these different levels of the left. There was no one dominant group, none. And no one would ever have confused the Labour Party with a left-wing group. I mean, it's just common knowledge. Every time they have a left-wing faction, they dump them. That's just the way it is.
So before, I wanted to let people know that if they want to start sending in questions, feel free to do it now, and I'll start noting them down. I wanted to ask a question about that conference. Because I wondered maybe, Jim, if you could talk a little bit about what was the thinking behind that conference. And I guess, Noam, after that, what I'd really like to hear from you is kind of, from reading the book, it really, I get the feeling there's a real warm kind of correspondence between you and Jim about it. I think you describe it at one point as being the most memorable conference that you ever attended. And I think you wrote that about 30 years after the conference happened. And I wondered, maybe could you kind of maybe speak about, what made it so refreshing and so made it so kind of reinvigorating for you. So maybe Jim, if you kind of kick us off, and then Noam, if you can tell us about your kind of abiding memories of it.
Well, the basic is self-determination it was really to do with self-determination of the individual, but mainly to do with the freedom to determine our own existence, whether as a group, a people, a community. It was really what people wanted to make it. People came from all different experiences and so on, and it was really just as providing a forum for that type of discussion where people could meet and talk and share, and they would hear not only Noam himself, they would have access to George Davies. George Davy and Noam had never met before, although we had a very good mutual friend, at least one, Harry Bracken. I'm talking about a very fine philosopher. So it was so much involved in it. It would be wrong just to see it as like something that was there with Noam. There were so many disparate voices there. So.
Unable to hear.
Okay, Noam. I mean, that's.
Oh, Noam, yeah. I guess from you, I guess what I'd really like to hear is, what about the self-determination conference, really sort of, what moved you? You know what I mean? Because like you say, you passed up this other conference to go to the self-determination conference, and I guess, and in your letters and your emails to Jim over the years, you really get a sense of like that it was a really kind of a warming and kind of really kind of refreshing event for you. Like different from kind of the more academic kind of circuit that maybe you sometimes seem like you're forced to move in. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about what was so great about it for you.
Sorry, I didn't catch the essence of it. Talk about
the self-determination conference that you attended with Jim back in 1990.
Oh, well, it was, as I said, it was a great conference. A lot of wonderful people interested. A lot of fun. It was ranged from serious discussions, often in the pub across the street, to what's it called? Kaylee, the dancing and singing, everybody participating. Just a couple of days of real enjoyment with fine people who were objectively, they would have been described as without benefits, unemployed, right, and not far from having any of the amenities of middle-class life. But it reminded me very much of actually my childhood with my unemployed working-class family, who were kind of similar. High level of intellectual interests, cultural interests, engagement, dedication, concern for doing something that would matter, and living the kind of free, independent life that we should aspire to. I thought it was a kind of a model of that. And it was very offensive to the establishment, not just the foundation that I mentioned. I remember when journalists came, you may remember this, Jim, journalists came from London to figure out what the hell was going on and wanted to set up a press conference somewhere, but instead we just met in a pub and talked informally and so on. They couldn't quite make out what was going on. But it was I even heard Scotch Gaelic for the first time in my life. So it was fun, enlightening, and an exciting experience. And self-determination starts with our own lives, moves up to higher levels, to free oneself from the constraints of the, actually, one of the themes that was brought up in the discussion, forgot by who, maybe by George Davy, maybe by me, was quoting David Hume's first paragraph of his First Principles of Government, the first modern political science tract. He starts off by saying that he is puzzled by the ease with which the powerful govern the many. Why do the governed accept to be ruled by the powerful? He said they actually have the power if they take it in their own hands. So the answer to this miracle, he said, has to be imposition of consent from the top, imposition of the idea that we have to submit, that we have to subordinate ourselves to the domination of the powerful. And if you can get people to accept that, then you're free to rule them, to enrich yourself, to oppress them, and so on. But they don't have to accept it. They can break free. And things like that, those several days in Govan were an illustration of how people were freeing themselves from the fetters, social fetters in which they're tied and in the cages in which they're kept. Well, it shows you can do it. Not easy. But it can be done, and that's why civilization has moved forward to some extent through actions and efforts like those. The young people in the streets of Glasgow are another example of it. It's pushing the limits, moving forward, breaking free from the constraints that keep the governed subordinating themselves to the rich and powerful. Let's go back to the sit-down strikes. They were getting close to a fundamental evil of our society, a modern evil, never accepted in the past, that you should subordinate yourself to a master. For 2,000 years, from classical Greece and Rome up to the late 19th century, it was considered a fundamental attack on human rights and human dignity, be with subordinating yourself to a master, what we call having a job. And working people in England and America bitterly opposed that. You look at the Labour Party. The Labour press was an independent free labor press in the 19th century, bitterly attacked this idea of being subordinate to a master, wanted to recover our rights and dignities as free people by taking over the institutions in which we work. The slogan was, those who work in the mills should run them. That's what you're getting close to with sit-down strikes, with many other initiatives, which strike at the core principle of domination, which was considered a total abomination for millennia, until it was finally driven into people's heads by the cultural, institutional power of the Industrial Revolution. But I think it breaks out constantly, could move forward, be the primary way to move towards a much more just and free world. And the Govan Conference was an illustration. Sit-down strikes are an illustration. Working, actually taking over factories is an example. The radical farmers in the late 19th century, mostly US, mostly an agricultural country, organized to create what they called a cooperative commonwealth, where they would be free from the controlled by northeastern bankers and market managers. It was the populist movement, not what's called populism today. The incipient labor movement, farmers movement, came close to unifying. If they had, be a very different country, a very different world, was blocked by state and corporate violence. That's class war, but it constantly goes on in one form or another.
Okay.
I wanted to get to some of the questions now. And there was a question from Alicia that I think kind of follows on really nicely from what Noam was talking about just then. You know, when you talk about the various kind of illustrations just now of you know, different moments which pointed towards you know, towards maybe better futures or better ways of running the world. Can you think of any illustrations now which kind of give you hope for the future? And also, Alicia wants to know if you're doing anything nice for your birthday.
Well, my current source of hope is multiple. One is the inspiring sight of poor and oppressed people fighting for their rights against often vicious, murderous oppression. You see this all over the world. I've seen it in villages in Southeast Asia, Central America, Middle East, everywhere. Inspiring sight. People are not giving up, suffering much worse than we could think of, but fighting on and sometimes gaining their rights. For time, I could give examples. Actually, the people, young people demonstrating in the streets of Glasgow is another example. People working hard to take the future into their hands, to gain their rights, to create a much better society. That's inspiring and enough to keep going. Beyond that, there's a very simple point, elementary point. We have essentially two choices. You can give up hope, help ensure that the worst will happen, or you can grasp the opportunities that exist, and they do exist, and work hard to implement them. Maybe it'll bring about a better world. That's not much of a choice. It's not a hard choice. And when you see people struggling to carry this forward under highly adverse conditions, you understand that to give up hope is just an intolerable luxury for the privileged, for people like us who can't accept that.
And for your birthday, Noam? I know Alicia also wanted to know if you're doing anything nice for your birthday.
Oh, the birthday? Yeah. Well, my wife and I are gonna take the day off. It'll be the first day in can't remember how long where it wasn't solid talks, interviews, all other classes all day. So we'll take off with our animals and just enjoy ourselves. How's that?
That sounds great. I wanted to follow up with a question from Liam Doherty, which sort of it's about you know, he's asking you know, is our creative capacity independent from our moral capacity? So you know, if creativity gives rise to sincere divergences in political thought, how do we determine what is moral or good? And you know, I'm throwing that out to either one of you there.
Well, that's a question that's been asked for at least 2,500 years when we have a record of it, probably long before that, probably 200,000 years ago. Actually, there are answers. Turns out that along with our common capacity for language and thought, this pretty good evidence that there's a common moral sentiment, a moral capacity, may be related to the language capacity. When you do studies with children, cross-cultural studies, turns out that on fundamental issues, they basically see right and wrong pretty much the same way. When you get to specific cases, should we solve this problem this way or that way, you can get divergences, maybe with good reasons, because people are seeing different aspects of things. But if you move to common human nature, there's very overwhelming conformity. So the way to solve differences is to try to get down to the point of common agreement and work up from there. And you can often solve problems that way. Not all human problems are easily solvable. Life is too complicated for that. But you can make progress. And there has been moral progress, substantial moral progress. You take a look at what life was like in England in the 18th century, or in France, where it was much worse, much poorer country. It's horrifying to read the descriptions of what life is like. But one of the great pleasures was torture of animals. That was fun. Great way to. I was just reading recently a book about French culture in the 18th century. One of the great delights was what was called the Great Cat Massacre, where poor and working people captured all the cats they could find in some area and tortured and massacred them, which was actually a kind of a working out a parable of the way they thought about the masters, the bourgeois. They were too oppressed to revolt against them directly, so they did it symbolically by taking what was precious to them and destroying it and murdering it in a manner so despicable you can't even think about it. But that was normal life, because life was, as Hobbes put it, nasty, brutish, and short. And the few ways you could relieve yourselves were by episodes of disgraceful, vulgar, savage behavior. That was the norm. Well, it's not the norm today. There are plenty of horrible things, but not that. Okay, so there's progress. Take the United States. The United States was founded on two horrifying crimes. One was the virtual extermination of the indigenous society. The other was the most vicious system of slavery in human history. It's a large part of the basis for the wealth of England and the United States. Well, at least we don't have that now. There's some progress in overcoming it. Nowhere near enough, but some. So things do get improved in many ways. Let's take the United States 50 years ago, not that long ago. Okay, what was it like? Well, the United States had federal housing. There were federal housing programs for working people and the poor, but they were segregated by law. African Americans couldn't apply. That was by law, not because it went back to the New Deal, not because the liberal congressional representatives wanted it, but because you couldn't get anything passed unless you satisfied the Southern Democrats, who were bitter, vicious racists and had extraordinary power. That lasted until the late 60s. There were anti-miscegenation laws so extreme that the Nazis refused to accept them. There were anti-sodomy laws. Take the status of women. When the American Revolution took place, it took over British common law, Blackstone. Under British common law, women were not persons. They were property. the property was owned by the father, transferred to the husband. It was taken over in the United States. Actually, that stayed on the law until 1975. There was progress in women's rights, but women were still not entitled to serve on federal juries or to be treated as persons. Well, that's changed. So there's progress. It's a battle all the way. There's often regression. The neoliberal period is a period of regression. But overall, there's slow progress through constant struggle and refusal to accept the effort of the masters to dominate and control. Okay, these are reasons for optimism, perfect reasons.
I wonder actually, Jim, if you would also like to jump in on, you know, what gives you hope.
Well, you could say that since the 1960s, there's been an extraordinary reaction. There's a real major reaction going on. And when we use a word like progress, it's like using a word like evolution, for example. These things are never given. They're never given to people. People fight and die for these. They're not concessions from the state. People actually put themselves on the line for them. That's why these things happen. If we look at the two primary things that have happened to ordinary working class people over this last several decades, it is always to do with the same things: health and safety, and long hours, and the conditions of employment. These things are, the way things are right now, are basically worse than they have been since before 1930s. They're actually worse for people. And the actual radical political expression of a fight against that doesn't exist.
I'd like to go on indefinitely, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave. I've got another talk coming up in a couple minutes.
Yeah. By all means. Yeah, no, thanks, Noam. Yeah, cheers for giving us your time.
Good.
Yeah. And I think it's probably about time for us to wrap up ourselves here. So yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to say thank you to Noam, thank you to Jim for coming, and thanks to everyone for coming here and participating and giving us some great questions. And yeah, I think that will be us for this evening. Yeah, and hopefully see you guys all soon.
Okay, thanks. Okay. All the best, Noam.
Good to see you.
Take care. Bye.